Hey YouTubers, making this video largely in response to Silverfuturist and some questions he asked in his video entitled, "Does our monetary system violate the Bible?" And I felt like it was an honest question. He's coming from a place where he's just seeking information, and so I I wondered for a while how I was going to respond to this question because there's so much I wanted to say and I didn't know how to organize my thoughts. But I think I need to first say this. God cares primarily about our spiritual well-being and not as much about our physical, financial well-being. And there's a lot of confusion about, in the Old Testament, the Jews were blessed with a lot of physical things, a physical nation, physical abundance. In the New Covenant, however, God was trying to teach them that the most important thing was spiritual, a spiritual renewal. And I've learned recently from the comments made by a lot of people on my videos as well as Silver Futurist that the Jews were looking for a renewal of the old covenant. They thought they had a pretty good deal. They wanted that covenant renewed. And see, God was wanting them to think spiritually instead of physically. And also, I need to point out that the covenant of Christ is concerned about individuals. It's instructions for how individuals are to have a right relationship with God, not necessarily nations. And so, you can't exactly apply the new covenant one for one directly to how this country should run its monetary policy. This country's policies and government, because we're a democracy or republic, is made up of the collective morality of the individuals, and we need to remember that. As the individual becomes more and more immoral, then collectively the nation is going to become more and more immoral. And one of the things we need to consider is how we enslave ourselves in a consumer-based society. We enslave ourselves to jobs so that we can pay for things that we don't need. Houses, cars, boats, vacation homes, our consumer-driven holidays like Christmas holidays and those sorts of things. Now, let's go back to the Hebrew Bible. In the New Testament says that these things are not that there's good principles in them. In fact, Paul writes in Romans 15, he says, "Whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope." Why are if the Old Testament is not our covenant, why would we even read it? Well, it's because the same God created both covenants, and God's nature doesn't change. His values and attributes don't change, and so by studying them, we can learn a lot about the nature of God and what He values and what He abhors. For instance, Proverbs 22 verse 7 is a spiritual truth. It says the borrower is slave to the lender. And so even as a Christian, I can look at that and I can say, yeah, that is spiritually true. That is right. That a borrower is always going to be enslaved to the lender until he pays off the lender. Well, if I'm a Christian and have been set free from slavery of sin through Jesus Christ, why would I want to enslave myself physically? Why would I want to exchange more of my time to an employer so that I can pay for things I don't need, like mortgage on a house, car payments, all those things? Now, I'm not absolutely opposed to anybody taking out a loan, and neither was it in the Old Testament. Some people actually borrowed money there as well. But as a general principle, I try not to borrow money or live beyond my means because of this Old Testament truth that I've learned about. Another one is Ecclesiastes 4:6, which says, "One handful of rest is better than two fistfuls of labor and striving after wind." I used to be very career-oriented, and I'd made career my God, but when I became a Christian and became serious about my walk with Christ, I read this Old Testament truth in Ecclesiastes. It's commonly thought that this was written by Solomon, the book of Ecclesiastes. And I thought, wow, that's so true. Is it better for me to work all the time and always be toiling and striving and never being satisfied? Or what's more valuable? One handful rest is better than those 2 fistfuls of labor that I was going after. Ecclesiastes 5:10 says, "He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, and he who loves abundance with his income. This too is vanity." And I was somebody who used to love money. I used to love making more and more money, but I was never satisfied with it, you see. And I saw this and I was like, wow, that is a spiritual truth. And so these spiritual truths don't change between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We can learn a lot from them. And I think if we employed them in our individual lives, then collectively as a society, the way we run our government would also reflect those values. There's also warnings against rulers in the Old Testament. When the nation of Israel was brought out of Egypt, there were slave people in Egypt. God brought them out and was going to give them the land of Canaan, the promised land, deliver that to them. God said, "I will be your king." He wanted to be their ruler and king. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai. But he warns them through Moses that one day they're going to want a king just like all the nations around them. And in 1 Samuel 8, 10 through 18, Samuel warns the people about choosing a king. And here's why I'm going into this, is because the king was going to take their sons and daughters and make them serve in the armies to fight. A king was going to take the best of their fields and their vineyards and all of their orchards and give them to his servants. Notice this. You think our tax rates are absurd. In verse 15 of 1 Samuel 8, this tax rate was supposed to discourage them from wanting a king. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. And down in verse 17, he will take 1/10 of your flocks and you shall be his slaves. So these people are wanting a king, and the prophet Samuel is trying to convince them, hey, you don't want a king. He's going to take 1/10 of everything you've got. Wow, we give much more than 1/10 today, don't we? And this in the Bible was supposed to be a lot to give to a king, because they were already given 1/10 to God as their tithe, and now their king was going to take 1/10. Let's see, what else? Some interesting things. Oh, God always brings judgment upon rulers who cause the people to sin. An example of this is Jeroboam. When King David, King David had a united kingdom in Israel, and then his grandson, Rehoboam, messed up and overtaxed the people and overworked the people. And so they had a division, a civil war. They split. And Jeroboam was a king who took the people who split and they moved and made the northern kingdom. But God made a covenant with him and he said, if you do everything that I tell you to do, I'll make you the same deal that I made with David. There will always be one of your descendants on the throne. But he caused Israel to sin. He set up altars to other gods. He set up an altar to worship God and make sacrifices both in Dan and Bethel, which they were supposed to only make them in Jerusalem. The point being, he caused the people to sin, and as a result, God brought judgment upon him. And notice why. He says, not just because of what he did, but he caused the people to sin. And that principle is throughout Scripture. God judges rulers that cause his people to sin. So it's something for us to think about today. I don't think God's nature has changed. Now let's look at Proverbs 11. It talks about unjust weights and measures. This is not the only place, but this is one place where it talks about it. God hates unjust weights and measures. Meaning, in the Old Testament, if I was going to sell you, say, a pound of meat, and you had your scale rigged up where I'm only getting, say, 3/4 of a pound, you would be cheating me. And God hates that. God hates unjust weighs and measures. Now, I think Silver Futurist knows more about this than I do, but I've heard that during the Roman Empire, they would take silver coins, and you'd think you're getting, say, like an ounce of silver, but they would actually melt it down with other base metals. Well, that would be an unjust weight and measure. You think you're getting a certain quantity of silver, you're exchanging goods for this, but yet it's really not. Well, I'm not a coin expert, but this is a 1964 quarter, and my understanding is it's largely silver. Here's one minted in the year 2000. See, they look very similar. Both have the head of Washington on it. The difference is this one has been diluted with base metals. Copper, nickel, maybe some other metals in there. I'm not a coin expert. But you see, this is not, if I thought I was getting one of these, and let's take this to 1 ounce silver coins. These are quarters. But if I think I'm getting a 1 ounce silver coin, but all I'm getting is 1 ounces of base metals, copper or nickel, that would be an unjust measure. And God says He does not approve of unjust weights and measures. He calls it abomination. All right, the next one. You can also apply that to fiat currency, right? If I think that instead of silver, they're going to issue me a certificate for that silver, but it's based on some silver somewhere in a vault that's backed by that. Well, if all that's taken away, if we just keep printing money and there's nothing backing it, wouldn't that be an unjust weight and measure as well? I think these are things that God would not approve of. Now, me as a Christian, again, God is concerned about individuals and their relationship with God. He's not necessarily concerned with giving direction in the New Testament to nations as a whole. But we collectively implement these in our own lives, and we make up society. So we need to be concerned with them. The next one I wanted to talk about is righteous. The righteous will always be spared when God judges or bring judgment against the nation. And you can read about this in Ezekiel 14. God will bring judgment against nations that defy Him, that do wickedness. He's not going to tolerate their wickedness forever. And we've seen this over and over again. Nations get arrogant, they get prideful. The Bible says that pride goes before the fall. And, we don't know when it's going to happen. The Bible doesn't tell us. But I can see in the Scriptures that it happens over and over again. No nation lasts forever. Nations come, nations go, but God and His Word always stands. It never changes. And so, read Ezekiel 14 if you want encouragement. So, regardless of how much silver we have, regardless of how much money we have, the righteous will always be spared when God brings judgment upon a nation. And say even if someone got killed, if someone is right with a spiritual way with God, then they will be spared and have eternal life with God. Again, God is trying to get us to think spiritually and long term, eternally, rather than get caught up with the passing pleasures of sin and greed, and even the passing enjoyment of money. Hope this was helpful, and if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below.